Conventional understanding is we grow more muscular size and maybe, if we're lucky, have access to the right exotic peptides or a wizard will accomplish something called hyperplasia. But what if hyperplasia is not only within the reach of every gym goer, but is in all reality the primary way we grow muscle? Have you ever heard someone say your first 6 months of training, natural training, will grow more muscle than quicker than you'll ever see again, or your first steroid cycle will be your strongest, or your first run of GH and Slim with steroids, etc., etc.? What if it's because each of these firsts elicit an increasingly tapped anabolic response that our body hasn't previously been used to, needed to set the hyperplasia process in motion? In other words, the stress of and stimulation from your first 6 months of natural training essentially pulls the trigger, sending the dormant, inactive satellite cells into action. During that first 6 months of training, your body is experiencing a new type of stress and specific novel stimulation that both calls for and accommodates the need for previously unnecessary muscle. So if we're just talking adaptation, then why don't we continue to grow and grow indefinitely? The unfortunate truth is the body loves homeostasis, or preservation, not 20-inch arms. In other words, our primary biological drive is survival. Again, not 20-inch arms. In modern society, the smaller you are, the longer you are expected to live. Think about dogs, for example. Cane Corso, 150-pound dog. What's the lifespan? 5-6 years? What about a Chihuahua? And no, we're not dogs, but have you ever heard of a 70-year-old giant, somebody over 7 foot tall that was 70 plus? I mean, maybe there's outliers, but I haven't heard of any. On the flip side, one of the little people from the Wizard of Oz movie from 1939 just passed away 8 years ago. They were 99 years old. And a lot of the little people from that movie actually lived to be well into their 90s and some over 100. So after the threshold, the plateau of natural training is reached, many of us turn to anabolics. We've been stressing our bodies with hard training and not getting further adaptation. All thanks to our built-in longevity safety harness, like a safety. What we need to do is trick our bodies into thinking it's safe to keep growing. Do you see what I'm saying? These are safety constraints. So we have to, by using anabolics, we're tricking our body into thinking, hey, we're entering another puberty. At what time in our life is it not only safe, but important, imperative that we grow? Childhood, infancy, puberty. And what hormones are churning out at puberty that cause us to have masculinized features and so forth? Testosterone, growth hormone, the same stuff we inject to grow. So using anabolics is essentially a simulated puberty. But those of us who have dabbled or more with the juice know eventually another plateau is imminent. So simply up the dose, right? Yeah, until you run out of runway. We've only got so far to go, right? At a certain point, there's a law of diminishing returns where you're just getting side effects. You get the idea. This is the standard linear bulldozer straight ahead approach. And in the long run, it's continuing diminishing returns, and it's pretty demotivating, honestly, even with anabolics. There's got to be a better way, right? I think there is. I've been following this stuff for 32 years, focusing on diet and pharmacology with most of what I've looked at. I started my first supplement company when I was 18. Didn't go far, but it was a good experience. I began amateur competitions in local bodybuilding at 26. I did a bit of professional riding in my early 30s, even predicting the Ozempic craze 10 years before it happened. So I'm a dabbler, but all that dabbling over time has given me an interesting vantage point. I guess I'd say it helps me to see the forest and not just the trees, and see how it lays out across time, and that information kind of comes together. 8 months ago, a friend of the channel reached out with a little link to a study on the potential of oxytocin for anabolism. It was clear there was something to it. And at the time, I was trying to solve the mystery of why everyone that tries Increlex, which is a form of IGF-1, raves about it, like Vigorous Steve and his buddy Aaron, I believe. But I'd never heard anyone get really good, serious results from any other form of IGF-1, including me. After locating the official real label for Increlex online, it was clear from the ingredients and instruction notes that the key was in its extended half-life. of 5.8 hours versus the standard IGF-1 half-life of, and I'm not talking LR3, but standard native IGF-1 of 2 to 8 minutes. Curious to see if the same applied to oxytocin, I ordered 10 milligrams from a peptide source. I was able to formulate a slow-release version in thick oil. Using this formula, I began to inject sub-Q and into the fat for slowest release. I was at the end of a bulk already at 215 pounds at that time. I'd been fasting previously and bulked up to 215. Thought, what the heck, let's see if this does anything. Let's just run some oxytocin for a while and kind of extend this bulk, right? Over the next 3 weeks, I grew faster than I ever had in my adult life. I gained 20 pounds in 21 days. After that point, the good gains stopped. Over the next 3 weeks, I gained another 7 pounds, even though I was pushing the calories as high as before, pushing the training and pushing the injections. And most of that 7 pounds was fat. There was a cutoff point. For what it's worth, during this time, I didn't change any other variables. Same generous milligram per pound of testosterone per week. Kept taking my ecti. My oxytocin experience, the slow release, sounded exactly like vigorous Steve's Increlix experience. It's clear that there's a similar mechanism. Around this same time, another friend of the channel, JG, thank you, sent me a link to an oxytocin study on cattle. It showed a 97 times increase in oxytocin in cattle that were given tren and estradiol. This is versus only 2 times increase of IGF-1 in their system using the same protocol. The study suggested that since cattle have comparatively few androgen receptors when compared to humans, that oxytocin might be a key signaler in the growth process. So we've talked about puberty and we've talked about growth hormone and testosterone going up in puberty. But what about oxytocin? When is oxytocin at its highest? When you're in infancy. When do you grow the actual fastest? It's when you're a baby, when your oxytocin levels are at their highest. IGF-1 is very high, growth hormone, right? While this is correlation, not causation, it does suggest a connection between oxytocin and high levels of new growth, and specifically the awakening of stem cells, including muscle satellite cells. Okay, so we've uncovered a new anabolic, and it runs out of steam after a couple weeks, just like Increlix. Okay, so what? The key to the whole thing. It's called myogenesis. And the first stage of myogenesis is called deep quiescence. Now, this is different than just inactivated dormant stem cells. No, this is the first baby steps into new muscle growth. You see, a satellite cell has to be in deep quiescence to have the best shot at becoming new muscle and surviving that growth process, that hyperplasia, that myogenic process. The growth process is as destructive to these baby cells, generally, the ones that aren't protected, as I am to repotting a plant and getting it to survive. And it's a very difficult process to survive. So getting into deep quiescence allows them to be more resilient. Deep quiescence actually fortifies the cells and makes them extra tough. The answer to the big question is, why do drugs like Increlex and oxytocin stop working? It's because there are no more fortified stem cells to grow at that point. That's when the growth stops. So the amount of cells that you have put into deep quiescence and fortified them and made them tough and to survive the growth process, that's how much you can possibly grow if you're giving it enough stimulus with food, with anabolics, with whatever else. Luckily, there are lots of ways to put muscle stem cells into deep quiescence. Ketosis, fasting, MGF, mechanogrowth factor, BHB, extreme mechanical stretching, possibly. With all this in mind, I put together a routine for myself where I train the entire body over the course of 3 days. During these 3 days, I keep my carbs low, near zero for closest to ketosis so I can get in 3 days. I cut out excess carbs, obviously. I take berberine for insulin sensitization. I take BHB, which feels great for focus, by the way. I'm on some right now and I'm loving it. All of these aspects, the training, the simulated keto diet, the BHB, the ketone bodies, all of that stuff is to put satellite cells into deep quiescence to prime the system to grow. Then I follow that up with 3 days of rest, high carbs, lots of creatine, lots of trimethylglycine, lots of protein, anything I can do to support growth, including taking long-acting oxytocin. So as you'll note, I'm not taking oxytocin during those previous 3 days. I want to kick things into gear after that. So I'm taking the oxytocin then. It's very likely that growth hormone or even, like ipamorelin and CJC, stuff like that would be good on those previous 3 days. But there's a possibility of doing this without any drugs at all. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate to some extent, is that there's a process to this that'll work for natties, it'll work for whoever. There's just different levels to it. Why 3 days rest? Well, because the deep quiescent stage is the first stage of myogenesis. Once that's achieved, the whole process takes 72 hours, 3 days. I'm somewhat approaching this as a continuous growth cycle, so I'm not trying to get leaner or lose body fat, but I can see more fullness, I can see more detail, more quality muscle than I've had before, frankly. But I want to make a side note here. It's not the only way to skin a cat. There's no reason a person couldn't do a full body workout, a simple full body workout of moderate intensity, and then take 2 days rest and grow. If you think about the numbers, there's essentially 72 hours in all of that, especially if you back your training back up the next time just a little bit and then skip a day, etc., etc. As long as you're giving yourself roughly 72 hours to fully grow the muscle that you've stimulated without putting your body back into deep quiescence. And I know we're talking about putting certain cells into deep quiescence, but the training itself is a stress that stimulates MGF. MGF is one of the things that causes deep quiescence. So if you're training, especially high volume, 5-6 days a week with only 1 day of rest, I suspect that you haven't grown in a while. If you back that off and take 2 full days after your last training session to where you essentially have 72 hours to grow, right? Minus an hour, plus an hour, your body will start to grow again, more than likely, especially if you've been doing that for a while, because all that stress has probably built up a cache of deep quiescent cells. What I'm describing that I'm doing is simply something that I'm trying out. Do I think it's the be all and end all? No. Is it working well for me? Very much so. And I'm going to keep playing that out to learn as much as I can about it before I go ahead and fast again and reset and reapproach. But I would invite you to do your own studying, look into this, and step back and get maybe a different view on how we're approaching muscle growth in general. I'm, in my mid 40s, closer to 50 than 40, and I'm on the same milligram per pound generous TRT that I've been on. I microdose daily. And the oxytocin that I've mentioned. I'm not opposed to throwing in a peptide here or there, but I haven't been. I'm not opposed to insulin, but I haven't used it in a long time. Last time I talked about it's probably the last time I used it. So a year ago, year and a half ago. So it's not like I'm doing traditional high level anabolics to make the gains that I'm making right now. This is just this process and using the slow acting oxytocin as the anabolic to kick things off. And I'm just taking it those 3 days at the moment. After my fast, I'll do a longer run and add even more muscle, I suspect. So that's the story of this so far. How we got to the idea of what I'm calling muscle farming. Anyway, that's it. So long for now, muscle farmers.